Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Davies, and I'm going to be reading to you the second part of the first book of bees by Albert Tibbets. This is the second of three parts, and just so you know, my guinea pigs are in the room and they're really hungry. So if you hear them, just ignore them. They're a little noisy and wishing that I had brought them something as a treat. Okay, here we go. Finding flowers. All day long in warm sunny weather, some of the worker bees, who are called field bees, fly back and forth from the hive to the flowers where they suck up the sweet liquid called nectar. Sometimes they may travel for 4 miles in their search for flowers. Occasionally, a bee who has returned to the hive from a food hunting trip stands and sways her body from side to side. This is called a honey dance, and it tells the other bees that she has found a big supply. We also call it the waggle dance. Very soon they will leave the hive to find the honey nectar that made the dancing bees so excited. This is the round dance, and this is the wagtail dance. In the round dance, the bee dances in circles. This dance seems to be performed when the source of nectar is near the hive. In the wagtail dance, the bee dances a half circle to one side, then runs straight back to the starting point and dances a half circle to the other side. This dance seems to be used when the nectar is quite far away. Some scientists think that it may indicate the distance of the nectar from the hive, so that the other bees can find it easily. If you watch bees closely in a garden, you will see that they work around certain flowers but pass others by. That is because the flowers are shaped differently. Some have their nectar where bees cannot get at it. Others, such as white clover and apple blossoms, are shaped so that a bee can sip the nectar easily. Scientists have made experiments that prove a bee is guided to flowers by their color and scent. When she does her honey dance, the others probably smell the nectar she has found and brought back to the hive. They may use this scent as a clue to finding the same field or garden or orchard. Flying home. As soon as the field bee has sucked up nectar through her tongue tube or proboscis and it has gone into her honey sac, it begins to change. No one knows exactly what happens, but probably nectar is changed into honey by juices that come from glands inside the bee, just as saliva comes from glands in your mouth. When a bee has filled her honey sac with as much nectar as she can carry, she flies back to the hive. Although she may have been wandering for miles from flower to flower, she always flies straight home in a straight line. This is why a straight line is often called a bee line. Making honey. Back at the hive, a field bee may give part of her load of nectar to a house bee. She opens her jaws and squeezes a drop of nectar out over her tongue. The house bee stretches her tongue out full length and sips the nectar from the tongue of the field bee. Bees are most likely to do this on hot, bright, sunny days when many flowers are in bloom and a great deal of nectar is flowing. No matter which bee has the nectar, this is what happens next. The bee spends about 20 minutes squeezing the nectar in and out of her honey sac and rolling it around on her tongue. This takes some of the moisture out of the nectar. Probably some chemicals from the bee's glands are mixed with it too, so that it is ready to ripen into honey. Storing honey. Now the bee looks for a cell in the honeycomb where she can store her honey. She may find one in the comb that the workers have built on the ground floor of the hive, but she is more likely to take her honey to one of the upper stories. When a bee with a load of honey finds a cell that is empty, she crawls in. Then she forces the honey out of her honey sac and uses her tongue as a brush to paint the honey onto the top of the cell walls. If she finds a cell in which there is already honey, she just adds another drop to it. So that a bee can crawl into a cell, her wings unhook where they were fastened together on each side for flying and slide one on top of the other, becoming very narrow. Without her hooking and unhooking apparatus, a bee could never crawl into a honeycomb cell to do her work. More about honey. When the cell is full, the honey is quite thin. More moisture has to be dried out of it to keep it from spoiling. This is the job of the air conditioners who stand at the hive entrance, fanning with their wings to keep a little breeze circulating. During the busiest time when many flowers are blooming, bees are busy day and night. Field bees bring in the nectar as long as there is daylight. The house bees work even after dark, keeping the air moving through the hive. After the honey in a cell is thick enough, workers cover it with wax. Sealed up in the comb, honey will keep for a long time, and the longer it keeps, the better it tastes. Bees live on the honey they make. It is their food. But grown-up bees do not always wait for the honey to be fully ripened before they eat it. They sip the nectar or honey with their tongues, either from a cell or from the tongue of another bee. Usually a field bee takes a small meal this way before she starts on a trip to look for more nectar. A bee's kind of bread. Besides nectar, bees also collect pollen and make it into another kind of food. Pollen comes from the flowers where the bees find nectar. It is a kind of dust inside the flowers which helps to grow seeds and fruit. A bee's body is thickly covered with short little hairs. Some pollen rubs off onto the hairs accidentally as the bee crawls down into the heart of a flower looking for nectar. But she also scrapes pollen off on purpose with her jaws and mixes it with nectar in her mouth. Then, while the bee is flying, all 6 of her legs go to work so fast you can hardly believe it. The front 2 gather pollen from her body with their brushes and mix it with the moist pollen from her jaws. This moist ball of pollen is then taken by the pollen brushes on the middle legs. Then with the combs and brushes on her hind legs, the bee takes the pollen and packs it into her pollen baskets. Her right hind leg packs pollen into the left basket, and her left leg packs it into the right basket. In no time at all, she has gathered 2 lumps of pollen that look much too big for her to carry. The pollen and nectar a bee collects for one load weigh almost as much as she does herself. After she reaches the hive with this big load, she climbs around on the comb looking for a cell in which to store it. When she finds an empty cell, she grasps its upper edge with her 2 front legs. Her other 4 legs are inside the cell, and her abdomen hangs outside. Now, her middle pair of legs force the pollen out of the baskets on her hind legs. The field bee who has collected the pollen then usually goes off and lets a house bee finish packing the pollen into the cell. House bees do not take pollen from field bees, as they take nectar, but after the pollen is in the cell, they crawl in head first and mash it down. They also add honey and perhaps some juices from their mouths to preserve the pollen. Now they have what is called bee bread. House bees seal the cell with wax and leave it until the bee bread is needed as food for baby bees. Grown bees never eat bee breads. Here's the cross-section of a cell showing bee bread being mashed down by a house bee. The most important bee. Of all the bees who take care of the hive and bring in food are female bees, and they are all worker bees. I didn't say that very well, but what I thought was interesting that all the worker bees are always females. Besides them, one special female bee in every hive is the queen. Her body is beautiful and shiny, and she is much bigger and longer than the workers. She is the mother of all the bees, and she does all the egg laying. That is her only job. The queen is the most important bee in the hive. She sometimes lays as many as 1,000,000 eggs altogether. A strong colony has between 50 and 80,000 bees in it at honey making time. So the queen has to lay a lot of eggs. The workers are never too busy to take care of her. A few of them always go around with her in the hive to feed her and keep her clean. Bees that don't work. In the midst of all the busyness of a beehive, the drones crawl around clumsily and don't do any work at all. They are the male bees. They can't gather nectar because their tongues aren't shaped right. They have no pollen baskets for gathering pollen. They are not fitted to do any of the work inside the hive. They do not even have stings, so they cannot work as guards. The drones are noisy, awkward fellows, always buzzing and tumbling about and getting in the way. Sometimes the worker bees even push them out of the hive to get rid of them. The drones have only one purpose in the bee colony. When the old queen dies or stops laying enough eggs, a new queen takes her place. Before she starts her egg laying, the new queen mates with one of the drones who becomes the father of the new bees. So although the drones take no part in the work of the hive, they really are necessary to the life of the whole colony. Here's a drone on the right receiving food from a worker bee, and you can see how much larger the drones are than the worker bees. Small cups on the underside of this modern hive are filled with wheel grease. Ants trying to steal honey bogged down in the grease. This kind of hive is almost always used in the United States today. Hives like this, made from a rope of twisted straw, are still used in some parts of Europe today. Early settlers in America used straw beehives. Sometimes they built roofs over them to protect them from sun and rain. Rough wooden hives or bee gums, sometimes made from the trunks of trees, are still used in some places of the southern United States. Queen of the hive. When a new queen is ready to look for a mate, she flies from the hive and finds a number of drones easily because of their loud buzzing. After making herself known to them, the queen starts flying up and up into the air. All the drones follow her, and the swiftest and strongest one finally catches her. They mate, and the queen returns to the hive. In a few days, she will begin to lay eggs. Usually, a queen mates only once in her lifetime, but she can often go on laying eggs for 2 or 3 years afterward. All during the time that nectar is flowing, she lays eggs with only brief rests. She stops if there is a spell of bad weather that keeps the workers from gathering nectar, but she starts again when they do. Then, when frost kills the flowers in the fall, she stops for the winter. In spring, she begins again when field bees start bringing in nectar. As long as the queen lays eggs, the workers pay great attention to her. They stand around in a circle, ready to feed her. As she moves around in the hive, she waves the feelers on her head. She can tell which workers have honey to give her by crossing her feelers with theirs. The workers open their mouths, and the queen puts her tongue to suck up the honey. They clean her and caress her and comb her hair with the combs on their legs. They even bathe her with their tongues. All this attention seems to help her lay many eggs. Oh my goodness, my guinea pigs are so noisy today. Okay, 2 kinds of eggs. Surrounded by workers, the queen walks around over the comb, usually in the lowest story of the hive, which is called the brood chamber, but sometimes in the second story, food chamber too. Often a beekeeper places a sort of grating between the food chamber and the supers above it. The opening in the grating are big enough for the workers to go through, but not for the queen, who is larger than they. So she can lay her eggs only in the bottom 2 sections of the hive. Remember that bees make the 6-sided wall wax cells of the honeycomb exactly alike in 2 sizes. Most of the comb is made up of the smaller size cells. Bees use these for storing honey and bee bread. The queen also uses the cells, both the smaller and larger ones. She lays her eggs in them. First, she inspects an empty cell. If it hasn't been cleaned and polished by the workers, she passes it by. If it is clean, she deposits a tiny egg in it. The egg is long and thin and always stands on end in the cell. Here's the eggs inside the cells. And here she is laying one. 3 days after the queen has laid her eggs, tiny grubs will hatch. The most remarkable thing about the honeybee's egg laying is this. A good, healthy queen seems to lay one kind of egg in the larger cells and another kind of egg in the smaller cells. The eggs all look exactly alike, but they develop into 2 different kinds of bee. The ones in the smaller cells turn out to be the workers. The ones in the larger cells turn out to be the drones. That is amazing. What makes a queen? But if the queen lays only worker eggs and drone eggs, where did new queens come from? They come from ordinary worker eggs, but they have been treated in a very special way. From time to time, worker bees build over some of the small worker cells, making them larger until they are about the size and shape of small peanuts. They are now the largest cells in the hive. As the worker eggs in them hatch, nurses feed them differently from the just hatched eggs in the small cells. From these ordinary worker eggs in the big peanut-shaped cells, new queens will come. Queen bees are made by worker bees. So just to recap, those eggs that turn into the queen are fed differently than the worker bees. So this new queen has just gnawed her way out of a royal cell. She will hunt down and kill the queens still sealed in royal cells. So she emerged first, so she will hunt down these guys, her sisters, and kill them before they can emerge. Beginning to grow, each bee, every bee, worker, drone, or queen goes through 4 stages while it is growing up. After the queen lays an egg in the bottom of the cell, the nurse bees keep a close watch over it. Just before it hatches in 3 days, a nurse bee puts into the cell a small amount of food called royal jelly. No one is quite sure yet what royal jelly is, but most scientists believe that it comes from the glands in the nurse bee's head. The glands make the royal jelly out of food and chemicals in the bees' bodies. When the egg is hatched, the second stage in the bee's life begins. The bee is now like a little worm. It is called a larva. The nurse bees keep on feeding the larvas. They run around from cell to cell, making sure that each tiny worm is all right and that it has enough food to eat. Often, they don't leave it unwatched for more than 2 minutes. For 3 days, all the larvas live on royal jelly. Then, the nurse begins to feed most of them the nectar and pollen that has been made into bee bread and stored in cells nearby. But the larvae in the built-up queen cells go right on being fed royal jelly instead of bee bread. And this difference in feeding makes them into queens. Sealed in. At first, the larva is shaped like the letter C, but as it grows, it straightens out with its head toward the opening of the cell. As it gets bigger, it sheds its skin several times. Then its cell is capped with wax by the workers, and the larva within makes itself a cocoon. The covering on the young bee cells is slightly arched and is darker than the covering on honey cells. Drone cells are arched more than the worker cells because drones are bigger. The queen cells are pulled out into their peculiar peanut shape. So here's the pollen, the egg, the larva, and the larva getting bigger and bigger until it pupates into a cocoon, and then it hatches. 21 days go by from the time a worker egg is laid until a worker bee comes out of its cell. Finally hatched. When the cocoons are safely sealed into cells, the young bees start their 3rd stage, the pupa stage. Inside the cocoon, a great change takes place. The wings and eyes and strong mouth parts begin to form and grow. The simple worm-like creature is becoming a complicated bee. At last, the bee is fully formed and ready to come from the cell. Now it gnaws its way through the wax and climbs out. It takes a queen 16 days to grow from the time she is laid as an egg until she comes out as a real bee. Workers take 21 days and drones take 25. The first days, almost as soon as the young bees leave the cell, it commences to comb itself with the combs on its legs. Then it finds a food cell filled with honey and has a good meal. At first, the young worker bees are fuzzy and feeble, but before long they are strong enough to clean and polish the cells in which the queen will lay eggs. Young worker bees also act as nurse bees. They make wax for new cells, and they help ripen the honey and pack it into the honeycomb. They are usually a week or 10 days old before they take their first flight outdoors. Some of these young worker bees have just crawled out of their cells. Others are still coming out. It's interesting, they had to clean out their cell as soon as they emerge. They had to clean their room just when they're hatched. Okay, that's it for part 2. Thanks everyone for listening.